Our last speaker, and by the way, we're going to go just a few minutes over, so Nick, you don't have to rush. You'll get the same time that everybody else did. So we'll probably run 5 minutes over or so total. Nicola Bidwell is our last speaker, and she's got a talk here on women and sustainability of rural community networks in the Global South. Thanks. Can we unmute you? Hang on.
Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Great, okay. So my paper came out of research about rural community networks for the Association for Progressive Communications project, How the Unconnected Can Connect Themselves. As we know from the first talk, a community network is a telecommunications network that is owned and run by local inhabitants of the area where it's set up. So I studied cases in 6 countries in the Global South, 2 in Latin America, 2 in Africa, and 2 in Asia. One provides GSM, voice and SMS services, and the rest provide access to the internet. Some directly to homes, others via Wi-Fi hotspots in public places, schools, or ICT centres, or local authority buildings. Some CNs were set up by local inhabitants, some supported by, most was supported by technical groups in non-profits and universities, and some involve government or commercial providers. So the national economies in the 6 different cases differ. Low-income Uganda, upper middle-income Mexico. Gender inequality indexes also vary, more equal in South Africa, less equal in Indonesia. But compared to national averages, usually there were more women locally, rurally in the cases, and fewer people between the age of 20 and 40. So I've been active in community networks for over 5 years, and I've been making informal and formal observations of international activists advocating for CNs. Since the start of this research at the end of 2017, I've interacted with organisations that initiated and supported the CNs in the cases. But most of the data in this paper is generated from 2 to 3 week visits to rural sites. And I did interviews, focus groups, diary studies and observations. I tried to recruit as many women as possible and equal to number of men of different ages, backgrounds with different relations to these CNs. That's including people in some of the support organisations, which are often outside of villages, and people involved in running the CNs in villages, and both users and non-users of the CNs in the villages. But I tended to speak to about 3 times as many men as women users in most cases, on average in most cases, and up to 7 times as many women as men who did not use the CNs. So local inhabitants owned the CNs in all cases, but often the CNs were associated with an existing governance structure in some way. And the ratios of women to men in these structures are low, from no women in Indonesia in the governance structure to 1 to 25 women to men in Mexico and 3 to 7 in South Africa.
It's 19 hours.
Sorry. CN users were younger than the local rural populations. And elders often couldn't even access themselves because of language, technology familiarity, and so on. But they supported the CNs because they recognized the importance of connectivity to education and employment locally. Nonetheless, they still had concerns about youth access and how it affected their participation in the community. Overall, men users in my studies spanned a wider age range than women users. For instance, there were many more men users over 60 and relatively fewer women users in the age range 25 to 40. In some cases, these younger women used commercial operators instead. So participants in most cases spoke of communality, but they had different perspectives on what this meant. In all cases, they described everyday support for other people's connectivity, like facilitating messages or using online services for people without access to the CNs. But while users said they always help those without access, women and older users gave many examples of being isolated or feeling dependent. Some CNs tried to revive past cooperative traditions. For example, the Ugandan support organisation supports an ethos of sharing among CN users according to local traditions to help unify communities that were destabilised by conflict and host millions of refugees. 4 cases in my study had deployed only a few access points, and these spaces where they were deployed were often gendered, which constrained women's access. For example, women users in the Indian case said that they only accessed the CN because their homes happened to be within the Wi-Fi range of the Gram Panchaya where the access point was. Women more often than men spoke of time constraints and the incompatibility of access with their domestic and agricultural work. Support organisations were initiated by men and comprised mostly men, especially in technical roles, and they didn't tailor training to rural women, such as women's daily routines. And women technicians in these organisations often felt uneasy going to villages where technical tasks are often associated with masculinity. So in the villages, I spoke to twice as many men as women doing technical tasks. Daily operation and management in villages involves lots of different tasks like selling subscriptions to the CN, collecting fees, coordinating meetings and so on. In 3 cases where people were paid for doing these tasks, men were 3 times more likely to be paid than women because the paid roles were for computer tasks and voluntary work was more often done by women. When women had a chance to do technical tasks, they were often quite good at them. So they were good at fine work like soldering. Women in all the sites also did lots of crafts and sometimes involved the internet in some way in these crafts. But men often trivialized these activities. Young adults in the villages are increasingly reluctant to do unpaid work in their communities. Some CNs have a very high turnover of young men who move to towns once they develop skills that they gained with the CN. And some women over 40 attributed younger women's not joining in the women's voluntary work groups to their use of phones outside of the CN network. Nonetheless, some women did benefit from access to their CN. For example, 2 women in Indonesia I spoke to use social media to e-market their mangoes that they buy in bulk from local farmers. The woman with access to the CN sells 10 times as many mangoes as the woman who has to buy airtime from a more costly 3G provider. Exclusion from the CN can prompt women to pursue independence. An example is in Uganda, there were 10 shops that share a CN solar setup and men owned 8 of them. And 3 of the men's shops are electronic repairers. They share tools and knowledge and assist with each other's customers. But rather than help a hair salon owner to get her own low wattage hairdryer when she drained the battery, the men cut off her electricity supply. And she said, we want a separate solar setup and we'll pay it for ourselves alone. Some women's enterprises involve their own families. In Mexico, a 70-year-old dad bought a computer for a single mum, his daughter, and she taught herself from YouTube how to use the computer. And now she runs her own telecom services independently of the CN. These type of enterprises require women to manage expectations about their identity and personal aspirations. For example, the Mexican mum spends her weekends serving in one community role and every other weekday doing voluntary work with other women in another community role, as well as doing her family responsibilities and her telecoms business. So to navigate gender roles, some women undertake communal work publicly and assist and do their own enterprises somewhat privately. Women have common struggles in their involvement with and their use of CNs. For instance, access to the CN and expectations about their unpaid work for it. And they have various strategies in negotiating these. But of course, as Dorothea's question to another person was, we must be very careful about generalizing. Gender never operates independently of other aspects of inequality, like age or caste. And women's exercise their agency in different ways over time. The scope of my study limited exploring these markers of difference, but that scope is coherent with the politics of international CN activism. To advocate for rural CNs, activists focus on barriers at different spatial and temporal scales than those that impede rural women's involvement in and use of the CN. This often makes their narratives gender blind. For instance, they tend to equate sustaining CNs with business models and scale, and this doesn't depict the unpaid labour. Local ownership is key to sustaining CNs, but it has gender biases, including expectations about care labour, governance, operation, and valorising particular tasks, technical tasks. With more women and older people in many rural areas, exclusion inevitably undermines sustaining CNs. For instance, older women spoke of depending on others for connectivity and how younger women disengage from their voluntary work. Older people also referred to the accessibility of simple phones that connect to voice networks, which suggests services suited to older people's practices may bridge generational gaps. Women's agency is not just about resisting patriarchal norms. To tackle exclusion and make CNs more sustainable, we should account for the different ways women already negotiate social expectations, their personal needs and aspirations. For instance, how women juggle tasks around CNs, current business models which don't account for their unpaid work, or how they reconcile their technical interests and their enterprises and their rural identities privately, not at a communal level. So I'd just like to say thank you to APC for the opportunity for research, and of course all my research participants in the CNs, and the support from the IDRC and from EU for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We are actually, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So would people like to engage on this last of the papers? Nicola, Nikki, sorry.
Yes, we share a name. Nick, thanks for the talk and the work. It's really great. I'm interested in how much the organizations who, you mentioned NGOs and other organizations that are helping to run the community networks, how interested they are in engaging with the issue of gender and trying to promote women's interests. So, you know, in response to your findings, do they take steps to try and make the situation better for women overall?
So for the support organizations like a university or like Rhizomatica in Mexico, for example, usually they have really strong ideals for gender inclusion. And all of them, actually, they had strong ideals, but they also have this ideal about community ownership. So they have often they have this quite difficult juggle where they don't want to impose an external view onto a community. They try to do the sort of workarounds, some of which are discussed in a bit in the paper, and some more stuff I've got coming up. But they also have another difficulty, which is even if they themselves have these ideals, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can recruit engineers themselves that are women. So they might have the ideals. It doesn't necessarily mean that internally they have a gender balance, right? And then on top of that, whenever they're going sort of to IGF or other places to be activists and to raise their voice in regulatory discussions or so on, that's very much a male domain. So what's difficult is maintaining that ideal when everything in the villages and in policy and then in engineering itself is masculine. So no, they're all actually very, very cool behind this stuff in terms of gender.
I want to ask if it's such a, actually we've sort of bumped into a really nice sequence in these papers, because some of the things that you bring up, I think were foreshadowed or touched by all of the previous papers. Are there any reactions from the other speakers to kind of taking this kind of holistic gender lens back through the work that you were doing?
I'd love to ask you a question. I do like the fact that we started and ended with community networks. Nicola, thanks for your presentation. And it's one thing that I think we struggled with in the Philippines was like this lack of remuneration of those who are maintaining the network, who are doing a lot of the hands-on work within the community. Of course, there's people selling airtime, but that's one or two people within the community. From the cases that you focused on and you studied, are there kind of innovative ways that communities are approaching the remuneration question and like compensation for people's time?
It depends if the support organization has got in a kind of classical CN. It depends if the support organization's got some funding, and then they find sort of technical jobs and things, and that kind of is one of the devices. Or in the case of the Indonesian one, which is not like a classical CN, it's partly to do with Indonesian law. But there they have a village enterprise, and it's like a profit sharing thing. And there are a mixture of interns who, all the money made through the community network and other things, or the top-up money made on it after costs, again gets shared between people. But that's not very equal. There wasn't that many women in that, and there was an awful lot of women who were doing a lot of voluntary work for the community. So that's one model. I think the real classic kind of CN, which had the most equal, even though it was a more a wealthier society, was Ultimundi in Argentina. Which you might have heard of, and there nobody gets paid at all, and there's lots and lots of, and to my mind, although it can't tick the engineering boxes and the regulators boxes of scale and all the rada, it's definitely the most sustainable model. So I think that some of this kind of fetishing, as the more I think of it, the more, and especially seeing how it's going in Africa where I live, the more that we come to this kind of citizen entrepreneurial model, you shall do it yourself and you shall follow the economic model, which is going to scale, and you're going to have this and you're going to have that, and it's going to get bigger. The more that you do that, the less chance you're going to have of working to address these things. but it's kind of hard to use. You know, regulators will laugh at you if you've only got a network of 150 people. So.
Okay, we've got one last one sneaking in under the wire. With the last question is from Dorothea. Dorothy, do you want to just go ahead and we can unmute you?
Sure. Nick, this is a great paper. I really enjoyed also you presenting it. And I think having multiple countries is a real strength in many ways. I did have a methodological question for you, just in terms of how you approached it. And I think on one level, you know, being able to kind of cut across and compare country to country is a real strength. And yet, Northern feminists often get criticized by Southern feminists that their brand of feminism can't be applied in the cultural context locally in the Global South. So I was wondering whether for feminist theorizing in context, you would treat these contexts separate, or whether you think there are some things that can be generalized on a theoretical level around gender and feminist theory across context. And I really don't know the answer. I really just want to hear how what your take would be on this.
So I'm not generating feminist theory, first of all, right? So I'm using it as a tool and a lens. Secondly, I couldn't agree more with you. So the next step towards this, and we didn't get more funding, was actually to localize all the research, to do it from a local perspective. So, so there's that. Where I would say its strongest lever is to say, well, look, it's mostly the Global North that it is propelling the community networks movement, right? They're the ones that are making training and activism and sort of oiling, whether it's through ISOC or whatever, they're making that space for more community networks, and they're teaching people. And given that they are so influential in policy spaces, and with seeding these networks in whatever, and telling the networks how it's the right way to do these networks, that a lens that shows them what they've got to be careful for, which might then mean listening more locally, right? Does that make sense? So I think the biggest lesson here from this paper, but I tend to feel like this with all ICTD papers, right? I think the biggest lesson is actually for us, not for anybody there. So, yeah.
Thanks. Hopefully this conversation may continue in coffee break or throughout the rest of the sessions and the other opportunities we'll have over the next couple of days to interact. I thank all the speakers for the presentations and for staying on time and bearing with us as we at least I figured this out. And it's just great to see everybody. Thanks to the organizers too. We're off to a really strong start. Thanks everybody. The next thing is on another different URL for the coffee break. We're gonna stick to time. So the coffee break's just a little bit shorter, but starts right now. And then we'll do another paper session later.
Great. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.